I might, on your behalf, call that an expectant hush, or at least one that's been slightly socially engineered. So can I welcome you all to the lecture tonight, to the Sir Kenneth Bailey lecture tonight. My name is Pip Nicholson. I'm the Dean at the Melbourne Law School. I'd like to start our proceedings by acknowledging the peoples of the Kulin Nation, the traditional custodians of the lands on which we meet, and pay my respects to their elders past and present, and to their emerging leaders also. I would like to extend a particularly warm welcome to Indigenous people that join with us tonight. There is a matter of housekeeping which I'd like to dispense with immediately, and that is, this is the moment where you turn off your mobile phone. If you're confident it's off, that's fine. If you're unsure, this is the moment to check. So if you could please turn off your mobile phone. And you may have observed that we do have photographers in and amongst us taking pictures. If you are uncomfortable about any of that, please advise my staff up the back of this room. As you've also probably observed, today's events are being recorded and we will upload the video of the lecture shortly. At the end of Professor Gerry Simpson's lecture, The Atomics, my colleague, Professor Bruce Oswald, will work with you on questions, so feel free to prepare them during the course of the lecture. And Betty Choi, co-editor of the Melbourne Journal of International Law, will give a formal vote of thanks on behalf of all of us to our guest speaker. I would like to thank the Melbourne Journal of International Law for their support for this evening's lecture and for their assistance also in the coordination of the event. I'd like to acknowledge some distinguished guests, including those from the Melbourne Journal of International Law Advisory Board. You know who you are. Thank you very much for the generous work you do in relation to the journal, but also for joining with us tonight. Tonight's event, as you know, is part of the Sir Kenneth Bailey Memorial Lecture Series. And this is an annual lecture that's been held at the school since 1999. It was established to commemorate the centenary of the 1989 Hague Peace Conference. And the lecture honours in particular the contribution of Kenneth Hamilton Bailey. Kenneth Hamilton Bailey was the fourth Dean of the Melbourne Law School, but he played a particular and a significant part in Australia's contribution to the formation of the United Nations in 1945. And we honour that through this lecture series. He was advisor to the Australian delegation at the United Nations Conference on International Organisations. He worked to revise the preliminary statute of the International Court of Justice, and he helped in the preparation of the final draft of the Charter of the United Nations. His contribution was formidable indeed. I now turn to say what I hope will be heard, Gerry, is a few generous words about our speaker. It is a particular pleasure to welcome Professor Gerry Simpson back to the Melbourne Law School. He currently holds a chair in public international law, as most of you would know, at the London School of Economics, and is a fellow of the British Academy. But many of you might also be aware that Gerry is a colleague of those of ours at the Melbourne Law School, formerly having taught here and indeed holding the position of the Kenneth Bailey Chair in Law. It's always a pleasure to welcome you home, Gerry, and we are delighted that you can give the lecture this evening. Gerry has also taught at the Australian National University and was an Open Society Fellow. He's an honorary advisory board member also of the Melbourne Journal of International Law, and that advisory board plays a key role in the life of the journal. Gerry is the author of many outstanding publications in the field of international law, most notably Great Powers and Outlaw States, published by Cambridge in 2004, which won the Certificate of Merit from the American Society of International Law. He's also recently co-edited a book with our very own Professor Sundhya Kahuja on the Cold War and international law, which is another Cambridge publication of last year, 2019. Gerry is currently working on a book entitled The Sentimental Life of International Law, and I am intrigued and looking forward to reading that particular opus when complete. Could we please welcome Professor Gerry Simpson in the UK?
Well, thank you. Thank you for coming, for a start. I'd like to thank the editors of the Melbourne Journal of International Law and the Dean of Law, Pitt Nicholson, for the kind invitation to give the Kenneth Bailey lecture this year. Well, nuclear war is a depressing subject, though, as we'll see, some serious statespersons, physicists, and political theorists adopt quite a redemptive, even cheerful attitude to the subject. And I suppose reading about nuclearism has the soothing effect of making the reader far less concerned about other threats to collective well-being. Coronavirus or Brexit seem positively benign next to the consequences of thermonuclear explosion. On the other hand, I remember reading in The Age years ago about a survey of high school students and their greatest fears. I think nuclear war came in around 8th, with being sent to the headmaster at 4th. So the truth is, though, we don't spend much time thinking about nuclear war these days, or it doesn't saturate or mark the culture the way it did in mid-80s Britain or 1950s America. It wasn't so long ago that the UK government was issuing self-defense guidance, protect and survive. Or the BBC was commissioning and then banning a film about the effects of a 1 megaton bomb on Rochester, the war game. Yeah, that feels to me like a different time. Today we live amidst nuclear weapons, lots of them, and at the center of nuclear crises, Korea, Iran. But ours is not quite an atomic age, and this is puzzling. It could be that nuclear war has been superseded by other even more dangerous disorders. The planet that might self-immolate has been displaced in our fantasies by the planet that will self-immolate. It might be that a certain amount of time has passed since Nagasaki and that we have forgotten something about the effects of these weapons. Or it could be that nuclearism was so bound up with the Cold War that we find it hard to accept that it could have survived it. My hunch is that nuclearism has been, or has always been, at least somewhat dematerialized. That nuclear weapons and nuclear annihilation are ideas that wax and wane. That the language of nuclearism matters so much more than the actuality of intercontinental ballistic missiles. So in a very small nutshell, the argument tonight is that nuclearism is an idea or many ideas, and that some of these constitutive ideas have been formed in an encounter with 3 practices of international law that I want to describe. So my report on international legal nuclearism isn't about North Korea or the Trump administration's unraveling of nuclear compacts with Iran and the Soviet Union. Instead, I want to go back to something I'm now calling Cold War international legal nuclearism. And I want to explore this moment from a few different directions. So later in the talk, I'll outline some ways of talking and thinking about nuclearism, from the often quite melodramatic forms of moral anguish found among the nuclear physicists who took part in the Manhattan Project, to the brute mathematics of Kissingerian diplomacy, to the poli-sci shoulder-shrugging of some leading IR figures, before going on to think about international legal nuclearism in its abolitionist and its anesthetizing modes. And then I'll finish on a sort of happy note with a pastoral international legal nuclearism that seems a more promising way of reckoning with the demise of planetary life. This subject arrived at my desk through the portal of a Cold War project I'm involved with my collaborators Sunday Pahuja here at Melbourne, though currently in Canada, and Matt Craven in London. As I began researching the Cold War, though, I was struck at once by the difference between two different yet coexistent temporalities, what David Scott called historical time and biographical time. I would read about Chernenko's death or the SS-20 deployment in Europe and realize that I was testing history somehow against autobiography. So in that spirit, I want to begin now in a slightly experimental mode and in the first half of this paper with what is a frankly memoirist account of nuclearism drawn from a longer work called The Atomics. The Cold War was a nuclear war, and I grew up in the midst of this nuclear war. Nuclearism infected our fantasies. The fallout was everywhere. It was in our houses, at our birthday parties. But for me, this was not simply a coincidence in time. I spent the third night of my life, and most subsequent nights until I left home at 17, in something called an atomic house. My atomic house was a greyish-white, pebble-dash Scottish council house affair, meshed with a half-hearted gesture in the direction of post-war architectural modernity. It was on a street just around the corner from John F. Kennedy Drive, and it was surrounded by hundreds of other identikit, classless in both senses, atomic houses. It took me a while to appreciate that houses could be built or look any other way. For most of my toddlerhood, houses were atomic houses. This was Levittown on the Pentland Firth, a made-up place where at night dreams of escape to London, to America, to Inverness vied for subconscious attention with nuclear nightmares. Everyone I knew grew up in an atomic house, and it didn't take me long to learn that the people who lived in them were called by the locals atomics. Around the globe, other small boys were growing up in similar places. One member of the Politburo, for example, complained that Russian atomic towns were like health resorts. In Los Alamos, the American nuclear base where the first weapons were developed, the local baseball team was called the Los Alamos Atomic Bombers, whereas our rugby team was called the Thurso Swifts. The Manhattan Project people in the United States, meanwhile, at Oak Ridge, had their own little atomic town, containing what one writer called rows of boxy post-war houses. Judged by the not extensive writing on the experience of living in these places, they were unusually well provided for and highly planned. Nuclearism, massively dependent on state funding and dedicated to the regimentation of fun, was a socialist experience, whether you were in Minsk, Thurso, or Oak Ridge. In one sense, then, this was a happy childhood, maybe even idyllic, played out in a living, breathing modernist utopia. But it was a dangerous moment in history. In 1988, the Bulletin of Scientists doomsday clock was at 4 minutes to midnight. That was the latest time it had been at that time. It's now 80 seconds to midnight. While I was growing up, there were so many weapons that the United States was running out of places to target and had begun to target shoe factories. The Soviets were stationing SS-20s, intermediate ballistic missiles, in Europe. In maps circulating at the time, quite a number of them seemed to be pointing directly at Scotland. The government was being less than reassuring. In one piece of advice, they suggested that parents make sure children were identifiable before sending them to school. A Home Office circular at the time stated, when radiological conditions permit movement, district and borough councillors should assume that one of the priority tasks for their staff would be to collect and cremate or inter human remains in mass graves. Once the initial clearance of corpses has been completed, A return to pre-attack formalities should be the subject in the longer term. These formalities, I assume, might include a permanent nuclear winter and mass extinction. So there I was, an atomic, living in an atomic house in the middle of an atomic war. In one recurring dream, I used to have it every Christmas Eve as I dozed, waiting for my sisters, who were much less interested in Santa Claus than I, to awaken. I would look up at the sky and see large Soviet planes circling my garden at 30,000 feet. The fact that these planes were called Bears and carried in their undercarriages the means to vaporize the Highlands of Scotland hardly helped. These Bears circled my dreams. Occasionally, like a projection of my subconscious, actual Soviet bombers would appear in the actual sky and be chased away by American Phantom jets in little pretend dogfights. Down below, I would enact this balletic aerial combat with Second World War airfix kit. Alongside nuclear extinction, in my school, everyone was obsessed with the Second World War. All the talk at Miller Academy School was of hurricanes and Spitfires and Messerschmitts and Nazis. It was a way of distracting us from the horrors of nuclear war, from what Lin-Manuel in a poem has called the suave, brilliant wattage of the bomb. Like most children, I was really worried about dying. As a teenager, I used to devour books with titles like The Third World War. In the more geopolitically alert of these novels, this conflict invariably breaks out in and over Yugoslavia. Tito's wooing of the West and fear of the Soviets, and then the reverse, provokes a standoff, and then a war, and then a world war. It was all plausible, seamless, and scary. Reading these pulpy thrillers precipitated a period when I was obsessed with the mechanics of nuclear war. What would be the last thing I would see? There were lots of people to ask in my atomic town. The father of one of my friends, a scientist with interests in nuclear annihilation, told me at a 13th birthday party that I would see a tiny object like a bottle top in the sky spinning towards me, and then a microsecond later, I would be obliterated. I didn't sleep for weeks, maybe months. Walking to school, I would scan the sky for small spinning objects. I lived in a state of nuclear terror. In J.O. Morgan's book-length poem, Assurances about the activities of the Airborne Nuclear Command during the Cold War, nuclear-armed Vulcan bombers circle Soviet targets. Morgan, too, has a sense of what these missiles will resemble as they descend to Earth. And I quote, 30 black specks, all converging, little clusters moving over the map of the land, each one extinguished with a small white flash. At which point, a plan was to be put into action. British naval commanders in Polaris submarines, many fathoms under the sea, and no longer enjoying any contact with base, would have to work out, according to predetermined procedures, whether the United Kingdom had been destroyed or not. One of the criteria was whether the Today program on Radio 4 was still on air. In fact, the current UK government is a much bigger threat to the Today program than the Soviet Union ever was. The commander, according to Peter Hennessy in his book Secret States, would then open a sealed envelope from the Prime Minister containing one of 4 orders. The first order, put yourself under the command of the United States. The second order, go to Australia, if it is still there. The third order, retaliate. And the fourth order, use your own judgment. Yuri Andropov, who was to become the General Secretary of the Communist Party and leader of the Soviet Union, once described the American policy elite as atomaniacs. There were quite a few atomaniacs around my hometown. Indeed, in some respects, we were all atomaniacs, or nuclear conscripts. When I went to university, I adopted a series of leftish poses on virtually every question. Trade unions, anti-Thatcherism, the Sandinista, the inadvisability of privatization, the awfulness of Tories. Some of those hardened into political commitments, but around my left friends, I had a problem. They were not keen on nuclear energy or the nuclear industry. Like them, I was totally against nuclear war. And like the World Court in The Hague 10 years later, I thought it was a bad idea in almost every respect. But nuclear energy was different. It was the passage to free and clean electric power. At high school, I remember learning a lot about the Aberfan disaster when 116 Welsh school children were suffocated in 1966 under a collapsing heap of coal dust that had been carelessly stacked right next to their classrooms. They were just like us, and they were victims of a dirty, expensive, and dying industry that was about to be declared obsolete. That was the past, we were the future. I just didn't yet know how long that future would be. I knew nothing at all, for example, about isotopic waste or 1,000-year half-lives. But I had another compelling reason to be in favor of nuclear energy. Every weekday morning at 7 a.m., I would hear a car come to a halt outside our house. 3 men would be waiting in the car, in the dark, smoking cigarettes. Then my father would emerge from the house, and after a muffled flurry of greetings and laughter, he would climb into the car and speed away. It wasn't hard to imagine him being detained by the KGB or leaving on a Carrie-esque mission behind enemy lines. He looked like a character from Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy, someone wrestling with his conscience before betraying his best friends. In fact, he was fighting the Cold War every day. He worked in a nuclear power station called Dounreay. I have some slides, but I might just put the slides up during the question and answer session. He worked in a nuclear power station called Dounreay, situated not accidentally on the furthermost reaches of the already vigorously obscure Scottish North Coast. It was a place full of scientists wearing thick-rimmed, now vaguely hipsterish National Health Service glasses. The local comprehensive had the best results in the country for maths every single year. The classrooms were full of bespectacled little geniuses solving Fermat's last theorem. It was easy to feel innumerate, but the sense of shared enterprise in the town was palpable, maybe even thrilling. The Soviet scientists have described their nuclear towns in similar terms, and I quote, "In the first, most romantic years of our work, a wonderful atmosphere of goodwill and support was created around the research." My mother used to say that she had no idea what my father did because he never talked about it. My experience was a bit different. For one thing, he took me to Dounreay and had me stand on top of the reactor while explaining what would happen if it exploded. Scotland would be over, and it was strongly implied that I would be too. Later, we were obliged to handle, using enormous mechanical arms behind thick lead screens, pieces of fake plutonium. He told me that one tiny piece of plutonium, if touched by every person in the Highlands, would kill them all. In 1939, working at Columbia University, the Italian nuclear boffin Enrico Fermi holds a tennis ball in his hand and looks out of his window in Manhattan and says, "A little ball like that, and it would all disappear." Plutonium was named after Pluto in November 1941. Pluto is the god of the underworld, sometimes known as the god of the dead. Mostly, though, my father spoke about the promise of nuclear energy. The idea, as far as I could figure it out, was to fast breed nuclear energy through a fusion process that would, and this was the masterstroke, consume its own waste. There would be so much clean energy that a lot of it would have to be sold to the French or the Russians. Meanwhile, the national grid would be powered not by some child-endangering and dirty coal station, but by Dounreay and its technologically advanced white heat. Lights could be left on all day. Cars would become electrically powered and dirt cheap to run. I might get an electric blanket, and there would be no more Aberfans. Dounreay had its own disasters, though. as it turned out. There's a beach in nearby Ray, a village surprisingly untransformed by the close presence of a nuclear power station. The beach next to the village is one of these wild, unkempt northern beaches, not quite pretty and not a sort of beach where swimming was exactly encouraged. It's called Sandside, and it's been closed for around 25 years. According to reports, 285 traces of plutonium have been found since 1985 in or under the sand. But that wasn't the only accident to afflict Dounreay. Long after I left Scotland, I watched an episode of the BBC documentary series Panorama about an explosion at Dounreay. A 30-ton plug had been blown 25 feet into the air in an accident. My dad confirmed this story to me later. There was contemporaneous footage of a man in a JCB digger filling the hole with mud and large stones. He was probably someone local in the area. One writer describing the construction of Oak Ridge in the United States talked about how the bomb moved in and 3,000 hillbillies moved out. In our case, the hillbillies stayed very much put, if only in order to beat up fancy boys from the South. Whenever I was naughty, my mother would tell me that I had been a mistake. My mother and father had had a nuclear accident, a fusion, maybe a fission. Whatever it was, I was the result, an unexpected third child to go with my two elder sisters. I was born nuclear in 1963, just a few months after the October crisis, when the world had nearly come to an end. I can remember where I was when John F. Kennedy nearly killed me. I was in the second trimester of my mother's pregnancy. The Cold War fascinated me. In one of my early years at high school, our teacher, Miss Mackenzie, asked us to prepare a talk to give to the class on our return from the Easter vacation. Almost everyone in the class talked about their Easter vacation. I spent hours researching my topic, the Korean War and its aftermath. The speech was far too long and was a casualty of its own casualty figures. No one wanted to hear how many New Zealanders had died at Busan. The numbers were meaningless, but then they were pretty meaningless in Henry Kissinger and Robert McNamara's hands too. One familiar approach to speaking about nuclear war was through rationality, ultra-rationality or irrationality. Anyone who has studied nuclear deterrence will know, after a while, these ways of thinking and speaking begin to coincide. Henry Kissinger's memo to Richard Nixon, for example, sent around the time of the SALT talks, lists the number of expected dead after a nuclear exchange in a cold, affectless tone that strives for technocratic neutrality, but topples into numerical insanity. 1 million dead is a statistic. 1 dead is a tragedy. 100 million dead begins to look like a very black comedy. The numbers don't add up, or perhaps that's the problem, they do. At one point, Kissinger compares the percentage of Soviet citizens, 41%, who would die promptly, as if turning up to parent-teacher interviews, in the absence of an anti-ballistic missile agreement, to those who would die, 39%, if there was an agreement. The tenses are hard to figure out here. Perhaps nuclear war has no tense. At one point, there's a footnote 3, that states, these calculations were done using a method which does not take into account fatalities above 142 million. Pity the person, then, who's the 142 millionth and one to die. Not even a statistic, far less a tragedy. Later in life, Kissinger would say, I would say in retrospect that I wish I had thought about the implications of a nuclear war more thoughtfully. Meanwhile, Cold War doyen Caspar Weinberger assured readers of the New York Times that the United States had no intention of fighting to win a nuclear war, but that our policy requires that, if necessary, we prevail in denying victory to the Soviets. Such circumlocutions, often combined with religion, the Trinity tests, the Holy Lock, or infantilism, little boy, big boy, and euphemism, yield, population centers, are the very stuff of nuclear strategy. Even the word nuclear, even the term nuclear exchange has a strange ring to it here. suggesting that the two superpowers had merely entered into some sort of agreement to swap nuclear weapons by exploding an equivalent number over each other's territory. All of this war talk was married to a heavily gendered usage. Enola Gay was named after the Hiroshima pilot's mother. Fat man was dropped on Nagasaki. Little boy on Hiroshima. The failed tests were called girls. This has all been parodied in film, Dr. Strangelove, in literature, Gravity's Rainbow, and in song, Tom Lehrer and Randy Newman. Nuclear talk was dominated for a long time by hawks and abolitionists, or hawks who became abolitionists. After all, nuclear war has a habit of making apostates out of even its biggest cheerleaders. In the end, maybe everyone's an abolitionist. Robert McNamara in The Fog of War made a late career swerve, after all, in the direction of peace and anti-nuclearism. This man, Robert McNamara, JFK's Secretary of Defense in 1962, had nearly ended my life before I even had a life. About a decade later, and just a few months before he died, he bought me lunch in Vienna. All is forgiven. In late 2018, I was living on my own in an apartment in the East Village. In early December, I went for a swim at a local club and then came home to my apartment and decided to watch an old made-for-TV film called The Day After. Thinking it might be rubbishy in an interestingly anthropological way, I settled down with a cup of coffee and some toast slathered in Sarabeth red berry jam and began watching it. It was immediately far better than I'd anticipated. It begins with some vague off-screen mutterings about tensions in East Germany. And then three military types get into a helicopter and begin traveling across the plains of Kansas. They fly low over ordinary life, people going about their business, feeding cattle, riding horses, driving cars, in their houses, making love. This 5-minute segment is followed by the more conventional architecture of the horror film. We're introduced to people who will die. Jason Robards, someone from Starsky and Hutch. These people are going to college, planning babies, giving birth, quarreling. The whole scene is permeated by a mid to late century American decency. Later, there's a ratcheting up of tension in the geopolitical world. Reports filter through, but in a pleasingly indirect way. Sage commentators are heard speaking about Berlin and about NATO's outmatched ground forces. Most of this turned out to be poppycock. Then a boy looks up at the sky, sees the planes circling overhead, and then his world is over. This was my Cold War childhood. There was a nuclear submarine base close by to where I lived, where sailors were taught how to end planetary life. I didn't know then that the numbers of submarines used by each side was governed by the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty signed in 1972. There were NATO early warning radar stations opened in 1963, the year of my birth, and governed by NATO agreements. But in the various conversations around town and with my father, an acronym kept appearing, IAEA. I would repeat it as if I knew what it meant. The IAEA was on its way to inspect. An IAEA official has been spotted in the local pub. This, it turned out, was the International Atomic Energy Authority, an international organization tasked with regulating the use and movement of nuclear fuels. This is how I grew up then, an atomic in an atomic house in an atomic war governed by atomic law, the child of a thoroughly legalized, cold nuclear war. I want to say all of this, not just because the idea of a legalized Cold War is at the center of our book's preoccupation, the book that Sandhya, Matt, and I are writing, but also in the light of David Scott's contrast between these two styles of history making, maybe even historiographical moods. A historical time which we study and a biographical time we have or do live through. How are we to understand international legal nuclearism, though, as a historical problem? An initial staging of all of this would be, at the very least, attentive to the claims of continuity and discontinuity. And let me just track some of these claims briefly. One pervasive, probably orthodox tendency has been to see Cold War nuclearism as a wholly new development in human relations. The bomb is singular, after all, historically and grammatically. Bombs, up until this point, were bombs. The bomb, though, is just a single object multiplied by 14,000. One of them would be enough to destroy this city and cause a major ecological and humanitarian catastrophe. Much of the writing and thinking around Nagasaki and Hiroshima has this particular and particularizing cast. Robert Oppenheimer inaugurated this tradition in his comments around the time of the Trinity test when he said, "We knew the world would not be the same. A few people laughed, a few people cried, most people were silent." But then there's also a continuity narrative, the advent of Cold War international legal nuclearism thought of as a reversion to old habits, a return to what Martin White called the realm of repetition and recurrence. The Cold War then was just the 15th or 16th century, but with more powerful weaponry. So a host of political scientists and policymakers simply thought of the nuclear war as an extension, or the Cold War, as an extension of patterns already discernible in international politics throughout the ages. Famously, according to some very relaxed types, the weaponry actually helped. For them, the greater the destructive power, the less likely was the possibility of opportunism or miscalculation. Cold War nuclearism, then, was simply the prolongation of history by other means. Even nuclear wars could be thought and fought. As for international lawyers, well, if the choice was eternal nuclear winter or pacta sunt servanda, well, that wasn't much of a choice. This was the hope of international lawyers writing in the 1980s, even if for most political scientists, this kind of international law was just one more utopia. There was then among some lawyers a pervasive sense that the law was yet to be applied to nuclearism, and that when it was, the effects would be positive and hopeful. So in 1983, Richard Falk writes the following in the McGill Law Journal: "But that only now does a climate exist in which to argue forcefully the case for the relevant application of international law to nuclear issues. Here, international law is not quite there yet, not quite fully realized, still waiting its regulatory impact." In a longer paper, I argue that nuclearism, though, is neither an extension of patterns found in Thucydides, nor the occasion for international legal or realist utopias. Instead, I want to posit a Cold War international legal nuclearism in a style that I characterize as anesthetizing, a style that wants to convert, I had a quote from T.S. Eliot up here at first, that wants to convert bangs into whimpers or whispers. So if the Cold War was indeed a moment of nuclear terror, then that terror was heavily regulated. Nuclearism was neither some lawless space in which mad-eyed generals contemplated, perhaps even relished, the end of civilization, nor a terrain of missile-counting strategic specialists or unperturbed historical realists, nor even a site of law made up entirely of idealistic speculations about alternative world orders. Instead, and at almost every turn, the possession and use of nuclear weapons was regulated, authorized, and made legible through law. After Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the reality of nuclear war, because never experienced kinetically, was understood and projected partly at the metaphorical or linguistic level. And as we shall see, or as you shall see in a longer paper to be read, this occurred in film and in letters, but it also took place in the domain of law. Nuclearism was imagined in the structures and language of law, and it was made legible, perhaps even acceptable, through these structures. One way to read international legal norms as tranquilizing, then, would be to think about them in relation to similar everyday images of nuclear war. Two films, which I wanted to talk about but won't talk about, posit a different sort of banality as a counter-gesture to horror. One is Peter Watkins' The War Game, where the drone of bureaucratic announcement and the everydayness of postal deliveries in Britain are juxtaposed against the melting of eyeballs. The other is Stanley Kramer's On the Beach, where again, an every day of dinner parties, trams, and protests in Melbourne is set against a slow, impending doom. These two films then juxtapose the everyday with the coming catastrophe to produce a discordant, uneasy effect. At first tranquilizing, a film about how good life is on the beaches of a post-war Melbourne, but then stark and horrific. International law, we might say, has a similarly anesthetizing tendency, but its tranquilizing effects have a greater political valence and are less often offset by some achievement in the aesthetic realm of terror. More specifically, and unlike the two films whose purpose and achievement was to make nuclear war more present and threatening, I argue that international law made nuclear weapons lawful, usable, banal, and legible. So let me begin to come to a kind of end. So the possession of nuclear weapons was legalized through the 1968 Non-Proliferation Treaty with its weak provisions on disarmament and very strong provisions consolidating the privileges of the nuclear elite. US-Soviet nuclear rivalry was organized through a series of treaties whose central norm was the right to possess and use enormous numbers of nuclear weapons. Numerous treaties and conventions rendered unlawful the use of nuclear weapons, but only applied in the Antarctic or Latin America. A nuclear law for non-nuclear zones. And we see this in the International Court of Justice's decision in the nuclear weapons case. This is like kicking someone when they're down, really. But in its discussion of the laws on the use of force, the court emphasizes the right to use force in self-defense under Article 51 of the UN Charter, while reminding states of the requirements that this force, even nuclear force, be proportionate and necessary. International humanitarian law, too, offers little by way of solace to abolitionists. There's no outright prohibition on nuclear weapons, as there is in the case of, say, dum-dum bullets or chemical weapons. Even the RAND Corporation, a think tank closely associated with US government policy, recommended a US nuclear strategy policy aligned with the laws of war and one that would permit the use of nuclear weapons. In several resolutions, the General Assembly had already declared such use to be a violation of the Charter. Violation of the Charter sounds initially like promising language, but this idea of a violation proved to be not just an exercise in bathos, but a Trojan horse helpful to those who wanted to argue for the legality of nuclear weapons. As many people have pointed out, the translation of moral imperative into legal language has the effect of opening up the imperative or the prohibition to a panoply of legal defenses and justifications. But there's a bigger problem, and that's the problem of legibility, something that Raymond Gaeta, who was to be here but can't be here, spoke about, or what I would characterize as over-legibility. Public international law made nuclear obliteration legible by discussing it in terms of proportionality and discrimination, and a breach of the Geneva Convention. Sure, it would be disproportionate to end planetary life, certainly discriminatory to murder the world's toddlers. A breach of the Geneva Conventions to render blind the inhabitants of Amsterdam. But is this the right language for all of this? This is an international law that threatens, I think, to topple over into absurdity, or at least irony. So in the end, the International Court of Justice does two things it probably didn't quite intend to do. It renders nuclear weapons legible and it renders them usable. It establishes that the foundational nuclear norm in international law is the right to possess and use nuclear weapons. And it makes the possession and use of such weapons comprehensible in a perhaps civilized version of Henry Kissinger's death counts. Okay, coming to a real true ending. Is there another way to speak and think about the existence of nuclear weapons? Or what Philip Allott called a permanent insult to humanity? Do we have, or can we create, a language capable of breaking out or undercutting the conventions of legal diplomacy and the routines of international legal nuclearism, a heretical Cold War international law, if you like. Well, I've written elsewhere about the prospects for an alternative lawful language of gardening, of objects, of monuments, and of sentiments. We can see a particular example of the work of the everyday in diplomacy's pastoral style in a letter sent by Khrushchev to Castro on January the 31st, 1963, 2 months before I was born, and a few months after the Cuban Missile Crisis had ended. I think it's customary to have water rather than wine at this point in the talk, but never mind. To read these letters and some of the exchanges between the two is to be transported back to a different sort of diplomacy, a contrast to the crudeness and bombast of Trumpian low style or the Obama-era condescensions or the apocalyptic jokiness of Reagan's evil empire period. But it also represents a departure from the various combinations of frozen mathematical ultra-masculinity of the Kissinger-era nuclear talk and the cool disassociations or abolitionist fantasies of international legal nuclearism. In the letter to Castro, Khrushchev adopts a gentle, meandering, poetic style that is, in a way, a gesture to a world in which time and space have suddenly become precarious in the aftermath of a moment in history when nuclear war threatened an end to time and an end to inhabitable space on Earth. The opening paragraph of the letter is devoted to the idea of temporality, how long Khrushchev had been thinking about writing to Castro, where he began writing the letter, the passage of time as the letter is written. He situates his writing of the letter in a series of tenses. I've been thinking of writing this letter to you, and now I am writing this letter to you. This is followed by a childlike wonder at the consummation of the task, before he goes on to describe a particular passage of time through the cycles of seasons. And I quote, "Every season, spring, summer, autumn, and winter, has its own delights." He wants to invoke the possibility of endless time to set alongside the near miss of the October crisis. So there are references to a long time and Cuba's eternal summer. Many people in the world, after all, thought 1962 would be the last summer on Earth. "We are looking to the future," says Khrushchev later in the letter. He then goes on to describe the Russian landscape, the earth covered with snow, the forests covered with frost. "I wish you could see it now," he says to Castro in the letter. The letter continues in this frankly romantic vein for some time before he puts a stop to what he calls these ramblings about nature. But the ramblings are really the point, because the letter is designed to restore Soviet-Cuban relations. Castro had wanted a more muscular approach from the Soviets during the October crisis, perhaps even a nuclear attack. And also to restate, in a kind of poetic diplomacy, why Castro's hot-headedness was so misguided in October '62. Khrushchev is placing the interests of time and landscape ahead of those of sovereignty or personal self-assertion, at a time when Cuba, the Soviet Union, and the United States came close to war, as he puts it. In these bucolic musings, Khrushchev is developing a kind of counterpoint to international legal and political nuclearism, or what he calls the verbal abuse contest. The Russian forests, the earth, and time itself are the very things threatened with extinction at this point in history. Khrushchev is asking us to care for time and land, a pastoral internationalism in both senses. I have returned to Dounreay twice since I left home. On the first occasion in 2002, I asked if there were still tours of the reactor. There weren't. I was directed to a small, slightly makeshift exhibition center. The signs around the entrance read, "Dounreay, caring for the environment." If nuclearism didn't destroy the planet, it might save it instead. Inside, there was a story about Dounré's establishment, told in a frankly heroic mode. It was impossible for me to entirely detach myself from the spirit of this account. Men in white lab coats were busy building a new world. Some of them met the Queen Mother. In one of the photos, not this one, some men are standing around a nuclear core. The shot is taken from behind. One of these men is wearing a black polo neck under his lab coat. It's hard to tell for sure. The haircut seems familiar. Last year, I went back again. This time, the exhibition center was gone as well. Perhaps visitors had lost interest in the future. There was now a row of 3 or 4 rather forlorn-looking posters standing to the side of a windswept car park. These posters were deeply uninformative. And anyway, it was far too cold and blustery to stand there for long. We drove out across the old aerodrome runway where my parents had arrived in a DC-10 in the winter of 1959. I thought of them then flying deep into the heart of a great and terrible experiment. Thank you.
I'm Professor Bruce Oswald, and it gives me great pleasure to moderate the questions this evening. I'll take 3 questions at a time, and if you keep your questions short so that Gerry has an opportunity to answer them in some detail, and if you just wait until the microphone gets to you before you ask your questions, so that because we're recording these sessions. So there's one question up there, there's another question out in front here, and I'll take one more. And Matt.
Yeah, I think that the Cuban Missile Crisis was a lot more scary than your bare aeroplanes flying around Scotland, because at the time we only had the radio, and these ships were going to Cuba, and it was a matter of days, and all we got on the radio, because there was no television then, was the ships are still going to Cuba, and they won't turn around. And that was scary because we didn't know where it would wind up or finish.
Hi, thank you for the talk. It was really interesting. I guess I'm just wondering, so I think that most of us here can agree that sort of nuclear weapons are an existential threat to humanity, but I'm just wondering how you think they compare to other threats that humanity faces.
Thanks, Gerry. That was wonderful, as always. So I just want to ask you a little bit more about pastoral international law, because you set it up as pastoral international law, and then you set up Khrushchev as counterpoint to international law, and then you set up pastoralism as about time and land. But as university teachers, we're always told to engage in pastoral care, which is for people. So I'm just interested in the different ways in which you set up pastoralism, and want to know really what you think pastoral international law is.
Great. So what I might do is just run through my slides as I answer the questions, and a bit of multitasking. So that's just before I begin answering the questions, and while I think about the answers, this is the nuclear power station where my dad worked in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, Dounré. This is the core being constructed. This is the Queen Mother again. I sort of became obsessed with the Queen Mother for all sorts of reasons. I mean, partly because she owned a castle very close to the town I grew up in, and she was often found in the town, drinking tea and so on. So I became very fond of the Queen Mother. On my recent trip to Dounré, I went to visit the Queen Mother's castle. It was the first time I'd been inside it. And she obviously took a great interest in Dounré, because already you've seen 2 photographs of the Queen Mother. You must think that the Queen Mother is a nuclear scientist. There she is with a remarkable hat on. And that's the beach that I mentioned, which is now which is now out of bounds. You can almost see the nuclear power station in the very far distance. And there is the Queen Mother again, of course. So naturally. Okay, these questions. Compare it to other existential threats. That sounds like an even more depressing subject than my talk. It's interesting because I was asked this question. I've only been asked this question once before, and the only other time I was asked it was when I was on a panel with none other than Keir Starmer, who it's possible will be the next leader of the Labour Party. And when I was asked that question, I was asked where I rated terrorism on the list of existential threats, and this was in 2001. There was a panel on the 9/11 attacks, and I said that I rated terrorism at around 58th, and some people in the audience booed. I think it's the only time that I have ever been booed at a public event, but clearly that was just too blasphemous in the context. What's that? Can I, enumerate the other 57, yeah. So my answer, I don't have an answer to that problem. I think our list of existential threats feels a little bit skewed at times. I think everyone would agree with that. And I suppose this talk is about trying to get us, am I really trying to get you to think about nuclear war? It seems unfair almost, but I'm trying to get us to think seriously about the continuing presence of nuclear war and maybe international law's role in rendering it absent. I guess that would be the question here, rather than somehow comparing it to other disorders. I do think there might be some relationship between nuclear war and environmental catastrophe, though. There's something strange about the way we move from deep concern about nuclearism to sort of forgetting about nuclearism and then thinking about the long-term prospects of the planet, as if we couldn't hold the two things in our heads at the same time. There's some relationship between those two that would be, I think, worth exploring. So, Maddie, it's a really good question. Pastoralism. My pastoralism, the idea of pastoralism, as I express it through the Khrushchev example, is precisely a play on the two ideas of pastoralism that you so cleverly identify in your question. It's partly about the idea of the pastoral as a place, as a garden, as an effect of some sort, and the idea of pastoral as an ethic of care. And so putting those together, you get the idea of caring for a garden, or in Khrushchev's case, caring for the Russian landscape, and caring for the idea of time itself that seems so promising. It's a suggestive idea here that I explore over 100,000 words in my forthcoming book, The Sentimental Life of International Law. But that's the general idea, to precisely put together those two pastoral ideas. So I have written, you've heard me speak on the idea of the garden as an alternative to certain international legal devices. I won't inflict that form of pastoralism on you now, but that's precisely the idea. I don't know what to say to you. That's right. I've read a lot about the October crisis, about people going off into the golf course thinking they wouldn't play golf again, as if that's the big thing that mattered in their lives. That seemed to be one of the things that I read. Lots of people really feared for the future in that moment. Some books have been written about this 1962 moment. It's rather interesting that post-1962 is the beginning of the 60s, as if the relief of having survived the October crisis produced this enormous flourishing of intellectual, bohemian, artistic, creative energy in the 1960s. It all begins in 1963, as Philip Larkin pointed out. So yes and no. Both of them, yeah. Oh, it's not a question. It's a. No,
sorry.
Okay, I won't brace myself anymore for the. Yeah.
Well, thank you everyone for joining us in today's wonderful lecture. We would like to thank the Melbourne Law School, the Dean, and the events team who have
helped us put together this event and make this evening really wonderful. We'd like to thank the Bailey family for their support as we continue the legacy of Sir Kenneth Bailey. And last but not least, we'd like to thank Gerry for taking us down into the past and your experience as an atomic, living through the atomic age, into the present and our discourses, or lack thereof, of nuclearism, and perhaps into the future with dreams of airplanes and spinning like objects falling from the sky. Thank you for making time for us this evening, and as a token of our gratitude, we would like to present you with this small gift.